one in September on missionaries in Vietnam, and one in, I think it was the December 24th issue, on the children of the orphanages. And that's one of his major interests. Though he's going to talk today about, as you know, the subject, Vietnam, the aftermath, more than just the problem of the children in Vietnam. I want to tell you just a couple words about Jeff. I don't want to take time from your time with him. Jeff is a 1970 graduate of Macalester College with a degree in physics, I believe. And before his graduation and since then, he has been engaged in a number of service projects and worked with a number of organizations concerned with social issues and social problems. 3 times these concerns have taken him to Southeast Asia, 2 of them to Vietnam. Because he knew Chinese, he was able to pick up Vietnamese and to work with the Vietnamese people more effectively, therefore. The last trip was in last year, when he spent a number of months in Vietnam. And he came back with a very interesting message to tell, I think. One's always allowed a personal word about speakers when you're making an introduction, and I'll just keep mine very brief. I've known Jeff for some time, not well, but respectfully and affectionately known him as a member of the St. Paul meeting of the Society of Friends, and have come to respect him very much. And when I feel discouraged about the state of the world and the spaceship Earth that we're on, with the world getting smaller and smaller and the problems getting bigger and bigger, the thing that really encourages me is to remember the many fine young people I know that really give me hope and inspiration and confidence in the future. And about at the top of that list, I think I'd put Jeff Gates. And so with that, I'd like to let Jeff tell his story, and we'll continue from there.
The first thing I'd like to say about Vietnamese culture is how we can use language to see social patterns. Vietnamese, there's more than one word to use. Like if I'm speaking to you and you, I'll have a range of words. For male, I would have I, on, and my. 5 different words that I use. I would be like the example. Home would be like my father. On would be my older brother. And would be younger brother. My would be sister. The same sort of thing would apply to the word I. aspect of it is that it's complaint. There is, in fact, no sense of God. Out of the sense of if the society is destroyed beyond a certain point, it won't be able to be rebuilt. I'll describe traditional society, then go through some of the stages as I've seen it in sort of an oversimplified version. In traditional society in the Tonkin region in North Vietnam, the villages were very compact units, and they were surrounded by bamboo hedges. The emperor of the country really had no idea of what happened within the village. He had no idea of the population, of the number of bushels or gongs of rice that were harvested. He had no idea of the number of men available for labor. That to get support from the village, he had to negotiate with the village notables. So that Vietnam was basically made up of conglomerates of people functioning sort of like unions would function, as a negotiating power block with the government of the country. When the French came to the country, they realized that this village block was too strong a unit, so that they destroyed the village by individually registering the people and having people pay taxes individually, so that there was then no power between the central government and the peasant, nothing to negotiate for him, which made then the power overwhelming on the peasant. The Americans have moved, I think, 2 steps further. At least under the French, the villages existed as geographic units, so that there were the social relationships that went out and supported the people, so that they could rely on social relationships, even though in a political sense there was a relationship between them and the government in many ways. This unit was destroyed by the massive movements from the countryside into slums or into refugee camps, where many times villages would be torn apart and would live then in new groups of people just put together for administrative convenience. I think it's very difficult for Vietnamese in a traditional sense to work with new people. This is something which has been developed by the Front and other groups in Vietnam fairly recently. Since your identity is defined in terms of family relationships, and only family relationships, it's difficult just to get in a new group of people and then organize them. So the destruction of the village was, or the breaking apart of the village into separate families was important in terms of control. The last step that I see is what I think I've illustrated by the slides of the orphanages, is that the families themselves, this last sort of atom of social construction, is being torn apart by the economics of the war, the fact that there's simply no supplies available. And I think if the destruction of the family goes too much further, it'll really be impossible to rebuild society. There'll be nothing but orphans and people like orphans, that is, those without a sense of social relationships, those without a sense of direction. So long as the family exists, then further. Perhaps I've carried that too far. I see the creation of the refugees as being a very conscious policy of the government to control the war, and in some ways a very necessary policy of the government given their aims. That is, if the United States has to control the country, we have to depopulate the rural areas. When the people live in the rural areas, they have enough to sustain themselves, and they have enough surplus. And with this self-sustaining and surplus, they're able to make choices as to who they support. By moving them into areas where they are physically dependent for all of their needs upon the government can control them in a dependency relationship by simply squeezing the lines of supply. This was noted by government experts and written down as a conscious policy fairly early in the war. Samuel Huntington, a State Department advisor, sort of encapsulates the whole theory in this paragraph. This is moderately long as a quote, but I think it illustrates very well this process and the reasoning that is behind it. He starts,
For 10 years, the Viet Cong had waged a rural revolution against the central government, with a good Maoist expectation that winning the support of the rural population, it could eventually isolate and overwhelm the cities. The first outstanding feature of People's War, as developed by Mao Zedong and refined by the North Vietnamese, Sir Robert Thompson and other experts said, is its immunity to the direct application of mechanical and conventional power. In the light of recent events, this statement needs to be seriously qualified, for if the direct application of mechanical and conventional power takes place on such a massive scale as to produce a massive migration from countryside to city, the basic assumptions underlying the Maoist doctrine of revolutionary war no longer operate. The Maoist-inspired rural revolution is undercut by the American-sponsored urban revolution. The effective response lies neither in the quest for conventional military victory, nor in its esoteric doctrines and gimmicks of counterinsurgency warfare. It is instead forced draft urbanization and modernization, which rapidly brings the country in question out of the phase in which a rural revolutionary movement can hope to generate sufficient strength to come to power. I think in essence what Huntington said is what I had just said, is that the policy of creating refugees was a conscious thing, and it was used to create dependent people who would then support a government based on the giving out of supplies. The solutions to the problems of economic disintegration, as seen by the government, are sort of interesting. There's a number of contracts that have been negotiated with the Japanese and the Americans to use the refugee camps as cheap labor pools in order to serve industry, and that this is seen as the way to rebuild the country rather than resettlement of the people in the villages. And it's then called all sorts of titles such as modernization, etc., as if it were good for the people. The Vietnamese government wrote this piece and distributed it to industries starting in 1969. Bill Dagg, who worked with 3M in Vietnam when I was there, gave me this piece. Their view of the people and their attachment to the land is sort of interesting. This is written by Vietnamese government officials. The initial shift of the labor force from the agricultural sector to the services sector, and the current evidence of a return shift, although a result of the war, demonstrates the characteristic mobility of Vietnamese labor. The people have shown that they are ready to change to new and more lucrative opportunities, especially those created by the activities of allied forces and foreign contractors. Mobility, of course, is more extensive among the young, who, even more than their elders, are ready to change their places of employment for only small wage increases. He adds then, even though their new working conditions may be less desirable than the old. If there is any immobility, it is often due to one of three factors: lack of job market information, lack of national employment service, lack of housing. This would be the Vietnamese view. Vietnamese, in another document put out for foreign consumption, Vietnam Bulletin, spoke of investment opportunities, spoke in these ways. Ready-made clothes are now both practical and necessary goods. In Vietnam, their demand is met by local tailor shops operating as a family unit and by imports. Each year, these nations export substantial. So on. It then goes down to say a production of 1,500,000 dozen shirts is anticipated in the project. Production requires a land use area of an estimated 270 new jobs will be created. I thought it was interesting because when you read that first sentence, in Vietnam their demand is met by local tailor shops, and then that end sentence, an estimated 270 new jobs will be created, you get an essence of what economic planning means in Vietnam. You destroy a native village industry and the people and their means of subsistence, and you create a foreign industry that requires very few people. The rest of the people are then left dependent, which means that they're subservient. So much for refugees. I did want... When is this period over? 20 minutes. Okay. I wanted to say one more thing about political prisoners because I thought that was very significant, and then open it up for questions and we can go the rest of that. I'll go through the arrest and imprisonment of, say, one prisoner, giving the laws and then giving what an offense is. And essentially, I'm going to create a crime if I was in Vietnam in a minute. I'll read the laws first. By this decree are outlawed private persons, parties, leagues, associations that commits acts of any form which are, directly or indirectly, aimed at practicing communism or pro-communist neutralism. Shall be considered a pro-communist neutralist a person who commits acts of propaganda for and incitement of neutralism. So, neutralism is a crime because it's pro-communist. Article 19. A person having committed this crime could be sentenced under this law. Those persons considered dangerous to the national security and public security may be interned in a prison or designated area for a period of 2 years, which is renewable. Then later describes the means of implementation of this article, and it is strictly administrative detention. A person deemed national security risk would be held in a prison and then this sentence continually renewed without trial. Supposedly only the premier can do this, but the orders are very blanket, and province chiefs or even district chiefs would be able to detain people in this way. I will commit a crime so you can see what it's like to commit a crime in South Vietnam. This particular song sent a man to prison. On an autumn morning in a cell, a young soldier holds the bars, softly rocking back and forth his skinny body. On an autumn morning in a cell, the young soldier holds his face in his hands crying, and his heart and soul feel chilly. Softly he sings, "Mother, I do not want to kill my brothers, so I am a prisoner." Softly he sings, "Our people have suffered so much. Our people live in dark prisons because of cruel people. I do not support the wages for, I do not want to live uselessly." Softly he sings, "Mother, I do not want to be a mercenary. I do not want to kill people during a high rank." That was defined as neutralism, which by Article 2, number 93 SLCT, would be pro-communist neutralism, and the man was then jailed by a military court because of public security violation. Do people have questions on what I've shown? Yeah. Yes. The existence of these decrees after the ceasefire would be a clear violation of the ceasefire. Article 11 of the peace agreement said, immediately after the ceasefire, the two South Vietnamese parties will ensure the democratic liberties of the people, personal freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of meeting, freedom of organization, freedom of... obviously, the three edicts that I have read would be in contravention of this particular article, and since the two existed after the ceasefire, it would be a clear violation. Mm-hmm. That is, yeah. I could read you a little bit about the story of the man. The man is Minh Duc Thanh, and January 23rd, 1970, he was sentenced by a mobile military court for 5 years of hard labor for weakening the anti-communist spirit of the army in the Republic of Vietnam. I believe he was later released because of popular pressure. He would be like Bob Dylan in the United States, a very famous songwriter. He was released with the injunction that if he ever sings his songs again, he would be rearrested. Other people, of course, singing the same song would still be held in prison. It's hard to say. I mean, I have not been in North Vietnam, so I really have no idea in terms of what would amount to a political crime. I must say that I'm more concerned about the situation in South Vietnam because of the fact that the American government has such a large role. if it occurs in South Vietnam, the same as if it occurs, well, it does occur in the Soviet Union, I would protest it. And I would try not to give any funds that would encourage it. In South Vietnam, it occurs and we have responsibility. 81% of the budget of South Vietnam in 1973, and this would be conservative, it would be only the official figures published by the South Vietnamese government and by the American Appropriations Committee. 81% of the budget came from the United States, which would indicate a very large residual role, plus the fact that the police and prisons were virtually created during the time that American advisors were operating within the system. Under Bao Dai, the police functions in Saigon had been given over to a gangster group, the Bin Zun. And then when Diem was put in power, Colonel Langsdale, the CIA operative, and other advisors helped him to restructure the police force and then create it into the force that it is today. Yeah, in essence, I haven't answered your question. I imagine that people would be put in prison for opposing the war in some way, but I can't say. I don't think it's there's something like 200,000 political prisoners in South Vietnam and tales of extremely harsh torture that goes on. In North Vietnam, a Rand Corporation study was released, and the documents were, I believe, released by Tony Russo initially released parts of them illegally, and then Rand Corporation followed up by releasing the entire set. Tony Russo, co-defendant of Augsburg, then published an article in Wind magazine that I have the date of that went through what these documents contained. One of the paragraphs said virtually that the North Vietnamese government was one of the most popular in the world and that its ideals were shared by the majority of its people. I would have that quote somewhere, so I would tend to say that the problem of political prisoners would be much less in North Vietnam because the goals of the government are more in line with the needs of the people. This would not be my view so much as the view of the United States government in secret papers that were released that I've since believed. Well, probably not for a while. I did not really see that there was too many functions that a foreigner could play in Vietnam. The primary problems, as I see it, are problems of social organization, and that the social organization is impossible so long as the war continues, and that so much of the funds for the war and the direction come from this country. It's really more important to work on the problems here. While I say that, I am very concerned about keeping some sort of human tie with a few people, so that humanitarian gestures such as working with the orphans I see as extremely important, not because they're going to affect the society as a whole, but because they're going to keep me alive. When I watched the children develop and grow, I had the sense of something going right, a sense of touching someone and having some good. And then when I looked at the rest of the society, which I saw as falling down, it was a little bit more bearable because I had an interaction with the culture. Yes, in part no. A few years ago, there were bottlenecks everywhere. One of the bottlenecks was the United States government that did not want Vietnamese coming into this country. So they prevented the entry of Vietnamese wives as soldiers and what have you, or they made it as hard as possible. This has loosened up a tremendous amount, and it sort of reversed the other direction. There are bills in Congress that would pay the airfare of the children, that would give them immediate citizenship, that would set up computer services to facilitate the connecting of available children with available parents, all of these sort of things. The next bottleneck going backwards would be the Vietnamese government. that previously they had laws such as you had to be 30 years of old and childless after 10 years of marriage in order to adopt a child. Part of this came from domestic abuses inside of Vietnam. The rich have sometimes adopted children and raised them as slave servants, and that this is still a practice that I think is fairly common among the elite circles in Vietnam. Not that everyone does it, but I mean, it's an abuse that's widespread enough that people talk about it, and they try to institute laws such as this to limit it. This is beginning to relax under pressure of the U.S. government and under pressure of adoption agencies. The South Vietnamese government is granting waivers on its regulations with a great deal more frequency and with less hassle than previous. The other factor is a social idea that the Vietnamese view of Americans, or of Westerners, is formed from the actions of the American soldiers and the actions of the French colonialists. And in view of those actions, why should they believe that families here are going to be loving to their children when the soldiers treated them as goods? These fears are fanned by tabloid stories in South Vietnamese papers. One I remember seeing about girls kidnapped and raised as prostitutes in Saigon, or Singapore brothel, and it was brought back by a Vietnamese ambassador who then spread this rumor. So that with fears like this, it's difficult to have the children leave the country. The last bottleneck is going to be the orphanages themselves. The orphanages are set up almost entirely by religious organizations, and they see their larger institutions, the construction of schools, the construction of churches, the construction of houses for their followers, as being based on the orphans. The orphans came, and then on the basis of the orphans, they were able to get funds for other things. Now, there are not really sufficient funds being given now to take care of the orphans even themselves, much less these other institutions. But there may be in the future. There's something like $7.5 million which has been appropriated for child care. So they see the children as necessary. That would be the bad motivation of the orphanages. The good motivation would be that as religious institutions, seeing the society in turmoil, they think that the temporal world is filled with suffering, and that the only good thing that a person can have is the gift of eternal life, which is had through devotion to religion. So that by giving a firm and ordered religion to these children, they are saving them from the suffering of the temporal world for the good of the afterlife. I would see that as work, but in view of the situation, it's almost reasonable for them to believe that way. It's a hard question to say, because the orphanages, by and large, set up in the late 60s. 67 would be sort of like the first ones being set up, and 68 is when they really started growing. So that many of these children have not reached the 16, 15, 17 years of age when they would be released. It's going to be hard to say how well the children are going to be able to adapt with the training that they have. The older children in the orphanages do receive usually some instruction. They receive classes in reading and writing very, very young. Like when they're 4 and 5 years old, they don't really know how to speak, but they're taught to sit in the desk and watch a chalkboard. And instead of advancing their education, I think that really retards it. Since without normal activity, the children don't develop the curiosity and the ability to think. So that discipline is such a value that it destroys the capacity of these people to learn. The children that have been released from the orphanages entered the orphanages later in their lives, when they were 5 and 6, and then grew up from there, so that they would have some natural development already occurred. What happens to babies who grow up in the orphanages would be hard to say. Children 6 and 7 years old in some of the orphanages where I were not toilet trained yet, and their language development was very, very impoverished. This would be the Vietnamese social workers that I was with telling me about in terms of their language. So it's hard to say. Yeah, I don't see us involved in reconstruction so much as in continuing the violence. We have given $504 million for the fiscal year 1974 budget for economic aid. So you would think of that in terms of reconstruction, but I don't. After what I said of the refugees were forced out of areas where they could care for themselves into areas where they could be better controlled by the government. So that feeding these people is not so much an act of reconstruction or humanitarian as simply the outgrowth of what was essentially a military policy. When you take out refugee relief funds and other funds of that nature, you have for humanitarian purposes like the orphanages, etc., very small amounts of funds. And even the orphanages, I would say, are not really purely humanitarian because they relate back to larger political decisions that were made previously. Even things like Food for Peace are in many ways military projects. Under Title I, the Americans give grain to South Vietnam, and the South Vietnamese government sells this on the marketplace. This is to increase the supply of rice and then lower its price because domestically not sufficient rice is produced, so you increase the supply by selling more from overseas. This would be the humanitarian aspects to lower the price. The funds that the South Vietnamese government gets, they used to get 80%, and the Americans would get 20% of these funds. They now get 100% since October. These funds are then used primarily for the military budget and police work. One particular contract that we had left by the U.S. Navy was paid, the Navy contracted with an American construction firm to build isolation cells on Gongshan Island. The isolation cells had dimensions very slightly smaller than the old tiger cages. The construction of these tiger cages was paid for by funds generated by the sale of Food for Peace grain. So that the humanitarian is really a double-edged sword. I think to be strictly humanitarian, aid would have to go through an international organization without political motivation. The other aspect of reconstruction, of course, would be, as I read in these two documents, the investment opportunities. Reconstruction is building factories to employ 270 refugees and putting out of work so many thousand villagers. Production goes up, of course, but the ability of the people to survive goes down. Yeah, I certainly am very approachable in terms of if people want more information or if they have a project of their own, I'd be quite willing to help out in terms of bibliographies and my box of books and various papers like that, so that I can be reached through the American Defense Service Committee or through the library here.
If you have questions about various relief organizations operating there,
Yeah.
groups that he thinks, serve the people better than others. And that's an area that Congress is interested in, ensure that our money is being used for what it's supposed to be used for. I'm going to finish this by remembering something I heard you say a few months ago, and I think maybe it's appropriate right now, because this is such a depressing subject that it's just impossible almost to face it. And I think that's why the crowd is so small and why the information about what's going on in Vietnam is off our pages. I think we just can hardly survive what's going on, psychologically and socially. our family life and our social institutions are kind of disintegrating, partly because of our participation in it. I don't know. That's a big question, which I almost wanted to throw out. But Jeff said, you know, the only way I can stand it is to actively be doing something about it, and doing something with other people that I think is constructive. That may be a misquote, but that's what I got from it. And I thought that maybe the time had come when we had enough people here on the campus that we perhaps should have some sort of a social concerns group, activist group, to keep some of these issues concerning international peace still alive. Not that we don't have enough to do, but I think we have to find some way out of this kind of paralysis and apathy that is really very destructive. And so I would be interested in the response of students or faculty to this kind of suggestion. And I think that perhaps there are many things that one can do. Do you have any suggestions on this question, for instance, specifically about funds for a particular group or actions about Orphanages before we dismiss?
Yeah, the main action that I could see in terms of student groups would be on the political prisoners, because there you have a very clear case that has been picked up by other nations, Amnesty International and the International Red Cross and what have you. And if you agitate, there are some results. Some of the main leaders who have been arrested and imprisoned have been released because of international pressure, such as Novatan, and then a couple labor leaders and a lawyer that people have not heard of because of the actions of the AFL-CIO and the World Peace Through Law Group. That you can have some effect in limiting the number of abuses, and the documentation is just so clear that it's a very easy area to work in. I mean, you can just take the laws as published by the Vietnamese government and compare them with a peace treaty as published by the Vietnamese government and say there are contradictions here, and then back it up with depositions, so that this will create some sort of pressure on the government officials to lie. And the pressure to lie is in a way an inhibiting force. And when you have to say nothing, then you're free. When you have to lie, this brings you in a little bit. You aren't going to get much satisfaction because the letters coming back will be Orwellian in their denial of things that are obviously happening. But I think it would have some effect in the long run. Yeah. Well, having worked with this play group, I see that as really the most important. I mean, it sounds frivolous by comparison to the other concerns, but without some sort of activity, the children lose human capacities and are raised as vegetables, so that helping a group like that to do even a limited amount of work would be, I think, a good gesture. Yeah, the only other thing that I'd sort of like to add in terms of action is you really now have to divorce your actions from the fruits of your action, in the sense of if you think of everything you do in terms of its effectiveness, and will my energy create such and such a result, you're going to be too frustrated, because the situation is so complex now that the results of your action are just it's not possible to weigh, so that you have to act out of the sense of your actions are right, rather than out of sense of your actions are really having a tremendous impact. It's just that sort of period. I think that might be easier for the Vietnamese than for us, because they have religious traditions and philosophic traditions which have that sense that you act because of rightness, not because of the results of your actions, whereas we're more into cost effectiveness and all this other sort of stuff, which stymies our efforts.
Thank you very much. We're going to move over to the center for coffee pretty soon if anybody wants to come along. Chat. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.